Today's show is sponsored by Yafa Bay and her Spirit of Tepereth Metaphysical Marketplace, here to provide you and your naturally special gifts with guidance and support through your life's journey, providing you tools such as candles, incense, charms, jewelry, oils, crystals, and much more. Visit them at 1273 West Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio, or online at spiritoftepereth.com. You can find all our sponsors' information in the show notes on our website. Now let's start the show.
The controversial group leader in charge, ADOS, or the American Descendants of Slavery. The controversial group ADOS. ADOS, or the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS. ADOS, the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS. The controversial group ADOS.
Welcome to the Articles of ADOS podcast, a weekly show where we bring you the undiscussed news, articles, and information important to the American descendants of slavery, our friends, and our allies. This is episode 9. I am your host, Lisa Todd, along with my co-host,
Daud Giazon. On today's show, we will share articles from Vice, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Black Agenda Report, and the Columbus Free Press.
Personality.
Peace.
This week in our personality piece, I'm going to pose a question that forces us to have personalities.
What questions do you have for us this week?
In the wake of the protests and uprising across cities in America, seeing most of the news coverage, do you feel that our protest has been gentrified?
That's a very good question. No, I don't feel it's being gentrified at this point, given that it's in direct response to the tragedies that have befallen Black life, both men and women in America, that people, citizens in America, are righteously standing up against. What we do as a particular affected group and what others do as indirectly affected group, because it also impacts them, canary in the mine sort of model, is going to be up to our particular affected group. And so that is still yet to be laid out. But that is a fact before us. But no, on its face, while it appears to be gentrified, it is not yet gentrified. What it has been is a revelation that people, American citizens, are concerned about the plight of fellow American citizens that are all too often, lives are all too often destroyed.
And what I mean by gentrified, you can call it as well as co-opt, whatever word, explains it better for you. But, being in the protest and seeing majority faces being white, although the coverage on the news is the young black men throwing bricks, throwing rocks, breaking windows, burning things. That's the national average news report. But on the ground, like I was telling you earlier, it's mostly white. It's definitely Antifa. Antifa's there, and other white organizations that are a little bit more aggressive than we as a Black community is, as an ADOS community is. And we get blamed for that aggressiveness. I'm not going to say that, young Black men aren't angry and tearing up stuff, but it's different. It's really different, and it's coordinated. It's organized in a way that our protests never really are. We're more just reactionary, take to the streets. What happens, happens. This time it's well organized. So no, everybody's not burning down their neighborhood. They're actually burning down police precincts, And so it's a different type of protest that's happening. And it's, to me, I think it's gentrified.
How the white domination racist media decides to create narratives about all protests should not dictate our interpretation of reality. Sadly, for example, when the white domination media, and I'm saying this purposely because then it makes hopefully more sense, that they would set up a false dichotomy of whites who want us to just go back to work so that we can disproportionately die and they can get a haircut, was a fallacy. There are some truths to those particular groups who were funded by the extreme right to do that very thing. But the vast majority of people that were protesting that the cameras and narratives created weren't focused on were whites who are interested in vaccinations being mandated. Oh, by the way, vaccinations disproportionately negatively impact blacks who get them. Black boys in particular. There's so much data on that. To whites who are concerned about the expanding surveillance state, this contact tracing stuff will disproportionately affect who do you think? Black folks. So when I was out on April 12th, I was mingling with those white people who had their particular interests and concerns. Oh, but that some of them happen to coordinate with mine. My role, and especially my role in regards to the ADOS movement, is to how can we get these American citizen interests, because we are American, coordinated in such a way that benefits my particular American lineage group. That's the challenge. And that's why I say on its face, what was taking place was not a gentrification. It was particularly in Columbus. You have a city where there's a number of activist groups that have been around for years that very well could have used or tried to use this situation to benefit their particular agendas. Okay. Well, that's just a competition of ideas. We have that same ability to do. We have sadly lacked the resources, but not the vision of the need to organize. And therefore we can turn this into an opportunity that benefits our particular agenda, while at the same time seeking white allies, seeking fellow Americans to participate in our particular goals and interests as a particular affected group. That's our challenge.
And I get that. For years, we've asked, where you at, other people, whether that's white people, people of color, we out here dying. Where you at? Well, as you can see, they showed up. So you ask for these other communities to be there for you when you're dying, being there for you when there is an injustice. And I ain't gonna lie, it was uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you can ask for what you want.
There you go.
And you'll get that. But to me, the difference is it's a co-opting in a different way of protest that we're just not used to.
It will become
It's a little bit more aggressive.
It will become gentrified. It will become agenda driven that'll benefit other groups if we allow it. We have a chance and an opportunity to make sure that doesn't happen. What did they stand on? What did they come out for? An issue that impacts Black people. What could they do in the future with that? They could adjust it to fit their own particular goals and outcomes. We too have that same potential. And again, we can't allow white domination media to dictate how we interpret that reality, because they'll do that too.
Well, yeah. And I know I said, their way of protesting is aggressive, and I'm going to pose, shouldn't our protest be just as aggressive? Maybe because we continue to have to protest because we don't get aggressive. That case could be made for that. But, this is such repetitive. Martin Luther King was at the same point. We know now that the FBI and possibly CIA, which is totally illegal, participated in his march in Memphis. They did things to undermine that, to make it seem violent, to justify American popular opinion to go against King. It was already down because of his speech on Vietnam. But we know now that that was a setup so that he would feel the need to go back there and turn it into a peaceful thing where they could assassinate. So we can see the machinations there. We need to be aware of and capable of adapting to any machinations they do into the future. We already have it documented. More than likely a white/police officer was involved in starting the violent trend of making it into a historically anti-movement violence that gets popular opinion to move in favor of white elite desires and interests, not into the popular interests, what the people need. We need to exploit that to our advantage. They're willing to do that to undermine a justified movement, and we should never let them forget that they initiated the things they complain are the problems. At the same time, let them complain those things are the problem. We need to come back with what again, Martin Luther King taught us. He said that rioting is the voice of the unheard. It can't be no more complicated than that. People can expand on that if they want to, but that needs to be our response to that. We are not integrated economically into the society, so we should not be surprised if people attack economic symbols that exploit us.
Catch the fire. If you're ADOS, an ally or friend, we encourage you to connect with a local ADOS chapter and help change your local politics. Our ADOS Ohio chapter in Columbus meets every fourth Sunday of the month. For more information on the time and location, visit adoscolumbus.org. If you also need more information on the ADOS movement, our politics, and the agenda, please visit ados101.com.
In other Catch the Fire news, we are still needing signatures for the petition sponsored by Triangle ADOS, along with Concerned Black American Citizens, or CBAC, Phase 4 Emergency COVID-19 Relief for Black Americans petition. For more information, go to cbacusa.org or wethepeople.com to sign the petition.
Are you busy? Is the news coming so fast you can barely keep up? No worries. The Articles of ADOS podcast is here to help. Hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening right now, and we'll make sure you stay up to date on the news and information that affects you and your ADOS life. In today's Rapid News Reports, we have some articles that you may have missed, all in some way affect you and your ADOS life. Up first, we have
Nonprofits led by people of color win less grant money with more strings. From the publication The Chronicle of Philanthropy, written by Jim Rendon. Organizations led by people of color win less grant money and are trusted less to make decisions about how to spend those funds than groups with white leaders. According to a new report by the consultancy Bridgespan and Echoing Green, an organization that invests in and provides support for leaders of emerging social enterprises. The differences described in the report were sometimes stark. The authors analyzed 3 years of informational tax returns of 164 U.S. groups that were winners, finalists, or semifinalists in Echoing Green's highly competitive fellowship program. They examined 3 years of funding data for each group that applied from 2012 to 2015 to determine funding levels and other available information. The authors found that white-led groups had budgets that were 24% larger than those led by people of color. It also found that groups led by black women received less money than those led by black men or white women. For nonprofits that focus on some similar issues, the gaps were even larger. Among groups focused on improving the life outcomes of black men, revenue at organizations with black leaders was 45% lower than at groups led by whites. In some ways, this is not surprising. Leaders of color in the sector have been talking about this for decades, says Peter Kim, Bridgespan's Chief Learning and Innovation Officer, who co-authored the report. But the gap was even more alarming than I anticipated. Even when nonprofits with leaders of color won grants, differences remain. The research found that unrestricted assets of groups with leaders of color were 76% smaller than those led by whites. Among the groups focused on improving the lives of black men, the unrestricted assets of groups with leaders of color were 91% smaller than those with white leaders. I graded this article a good. It explained why so many of our organizations are underfunded. But at the same time, we also know through the myths of the racial wealth gap that Tone and Serendarity also helped co-author, that charity is not a way to close that racial wealth gap, but as ADOS knows, reparation would reduce the need for charitable organizations. Up next,
from the publication Vice, entitled Coronavirus Death Rates Are a Direct Result of Environmental Racism. Tagline: along with other forms of systemic inequality, environmental racism can cause many of the underlying conditions that make the virus particularly dangerous for Black and Brown communities. From writer Laila Atachvini. Last week, it became clear that communities of color from coast to coast are disproportionately being infected and dying from complications brought on by COVID-19. We've known literally forever that diseases like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and asthma are disproportionately afflicting the minority populations, especially the African Americans, said Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. A less discussed but major contributor to the health disparities between people of color and white people in the United States, one that has become especially glaring in the face of COVID-19, is environmental racism. Environmental racism refers to the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. This happens when the government and corporations, through the placement of oil pipelines, forever chemical plants, toxic waste dumps, and polluting factories, expose low-income minority communities to known carcinogens, asthma-inducing pollutants, contaminated water, and other harmful pollutants at higher rate than white affluent communities. Communities of color targeted for polluting facilities, waste sites, and the like also have higher rates of cancer, asthma, miscarriages, low birth weight babies, just to name a few adverse health conditions linked to pollution, said Robin Saha, an environmental sociologist at the University of Montana. States in the U.S. are rife with their own examples of environmental racism. It is the reason why polluting facilities along the Mississippi River are primarily concentrated in Black communities like St. James Parish, Louisiana. This area is known as Cancer Alley, where the risk of developing cancer is 700 times the national average. Environmental racism is a result of broader systemic discrimination that created and maintains structural disadvantage, Saha said. This shows up in the form of highly segregated, food-insecure communities with substandard and overcrowded housing. These communities are often lacking job opportunities, investment, basic services, and decent health care, especially preventative. This situation adds stress to residents' lives and contributes to those underlying health conditions that make people of color more vulnerable to COVID-19. I grade this article fair, poor because the article fails to point out how Dr. Fauci and other health authorities had to have known by at least late December that this virus/seasonal flu would have this very impact on ADOS neighborhoods. Good, because the mainstream white domination racist media is finally reaching one of the key root causes as to why ADOS in younger ages than normal is getting sick and dying as a result of this virus and seasonal flu. And next,
the real reasons that eventually Black does indeed crack. From the publication The Reporter, and the writer is Danette Mitchell. In the African American community, the idiom "Black don't crack" is sometimes said, meaning that the higher concentration of melanin in darker skin takes longer to show outward signs of aging than much lighter skin. While the idiom is rooted in science, it is not entirely true. The Black community is cracking on the inside. The result of multiple chronic stresses and the devastation of COVID-19 prompting Harvard University professor David R. Williams to write in a recent Washington Post article that another pandemic is looming. In the article, stress was already killing Black Americans. COVID-19 is making it worse. Williams explained the pandemic of stress. He believes the pandemic of stress will further sicken and shorten Black lives with disastrous long-term effects, especially for African American young people. The stress, according to Williams, is already affecting the mental and physical health of Black Americans and will have a dangerous impact long after the coronavirus has been contained. Experts say stress is beneficial because it moves us to action to accomplish goals and creates the excitement we feel when we're taking a dream vacation or learning a new hobby. Stress also serves as our warning system, prompting us to either fight or run from a situation. However, multiple chronic stresses, particularly from hostile conditions, can lead to serious medical conditions when we are unable to cope. People from disadvantaged communities are already challenged financially to meet basic needs while living in substandard housing and facing violence and pollution in their neighborhoods, Williams said. Many of them already have underlying medical conditions. Then comes COVID-19 with its challenges and risks, especially when many Black Americans and people of color must continue as frontline workers, care for sick family members, and practice social distancing in crowded living conditions. I graded this article a good. And up next,
from the publication, The Columbus Free Press, entitled Columbus is Number 1 in Police Killing Black People. Author Bob Petrakis. In the years 2013 to 2016, the Columbus police killed 24 people, 20 of them Black. MappingPoliceViolence.org lists the names of all Columbus citizens killed by the Columbus Police Department. Despite only 27.6% of Columbus's population being Black, 83.3% of all people killed by cops were black. Out of the 15 largest U.S. cities, Columbus ranks number 1 in percentage of police killing black people. Often, the police and their allies will excuse the high rates of police violence against black people by claiming they are just trying to stop black-on-black crime, a phrase popularized in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, as the United States created the world's largest prison industrial complex. Police shootings of black people are not reflective of high black-on-black crime rates. They are not the result of the police department's attempt to protect poor communities. A report from mappingpoliceviolence.org points out that there is no relationship between police killing blacks and community violent crime rates. Nationally, fewer than a third of black people killed by police in the United States were suspected of a violent crime or allegedly armed. The mappingpoliceviolence.org project found that black people were 39% of the people killed by the police department in the 100 largest cities, despite being only 21% of the population in their jurisdiction. The number was even higher for the killing of unarmed people. 50% of the unarmed people were black. An unarmed black person was 4 times more likely to be killed than an unarmed white person. Columbus not only reflects but amplifies these national patterns of police shootings of black residents. While a large multiracial coalition is outraged by the shootings and statistics, our city leaders seem to have embraced this killing practice. Local Black Lives Matter activists were stunned when the Columbus Dispatch reported on February 21, 2017, that the controversial Summer Safety Initiative would be expanded as a year-round police tactic. The Dispatch described it as an initiative that blitzes high-crime neighborhoods with police officers. The Free Press has pointed out that overwhelmingly these officers are white, many are plainclothes and undercover, terrorizing mostly black neighborhoods. They serve more as an occupying army or as a political intelligence unit in an authoritarian regime. I grade this good. And next?
Soros-funded group Vote by Mail must become the default option. Tagline: Vote by mail must become the default option for the vast majority of Americans during the coronavirus epidemic, declared the Center for American Progress. Publication: Breitbart.com. Author: Aaron Klein. The Center for American Progress, CAP, which functions as somewhat of an idea factory for the Democratic Party, has been a central part of the progressive nerve center pushing the vote-by-mail scheme. CAP is funded by Soros Open Society Foundations and joins scores of other Soros-financed groups using the virus to lobby for the overhaul of the U.S. election system. Analysts have posited that such proposals help the Democratic Party. Republicans specifically fear the prospect of voter fraud, since mail-in voting would be harder to authenticate. Danielle Root serves on the Democracy and Government Reform team at the CAP. She penned a column lamenting how in-person voting still remains the most popular method of casting ballots in most states, although voting by mail is used broadly in a handful of places. Root urges states officials must not delay in implementing vital policies such as vote by mail and extended early voting for upcoming elections. Nor must Congress delay providing additional funding in the amount of $4 billion as recommended by noted experts for states to make all necessary upgrades to election procedures and infrastructure in time for upcoming elections. The CAP activist cautions that although vote by mail must become the default option for the vast majority of Americans during this health crisis, the vote by mail system is not an ideal or accessible option for many others. She wrote that preserving in-person voting for a segment of the population is important to protect against what she described in a previous column as possible voter disenfranchisement. I graded this article an OK. I chose this article to see what other news sources, other voices were discussing. But it's the same old hate liberal conservative talking points. Up next,
from the broadcast, ABC News, entitled Racism Declared a Public Health Crisis in Ohio's Most Populated County. Tagline: The disparities have been underscored from the coronavirus pandemic. Writer: Ella Torres. Officials in Ohio have declared racism a public health crisis in the state's most populated county. Commissioners in the Franklin County passed a resolution Tuesday that makes the declaration, as well as vows to support community efforts on racism and ensure that board commissioners will work under anti-racism principles. The resolution was in the works well before the novel coronavirus crisis, according to officials. Racism has been a pandemic long before the current coronavirus pandemic, Commissioner Kevin L. Boyce said in a statement. Our declaration today is important, but it's not saying anything that hasn't been apparent for a long time. COVID-19 has heightened the health divide between Black and white Ohioans. However, and I hope that it can be the catalyst we need to reform the whole health system so that it works for all of us equally. Racism may be intentional or unintentional, Joe Mazzola, the Franklin County Health Commissioner, said in a statement. We must address injustices caused by racism, and we must support actions at all levels to ensure equal opportunity for all. The county's public health agency noted that racism and segregation in Ohio and Franklin County have exacerbated a high divide, resulting in Black Ohioans having lower life expectancies than white Ohioans. Black residents are more likely than other races to die prematurely before the age of 75. They have a nearly 3 times higher rate of infant mortality, and they are more likely to be overweight or obese and have adult onset diabetes, according to the Franklin County Board of Health. Hundreds of years of systemic racism, from slavery to segregation, redlining to Jim Crow, and discrimination in housing, finance, and education, some of which persist today, have led to predictable inequities, Commissioner Marilyn Brown said in a statement. We won't solve these things overnight, but it's important to start by recognizing them and beginning to work purposefully for change. I grade this good, fair. It is change from earlier this month when deaths of Blacks were reported not to be in line with national figures, yet the article did not explain why. Excellent in that it points out what should have been clear a century ago. White domination racism is a public health issue worse than any virus in the modern era. And next?
It's not obesity, it's slavery. From the publication The New York Times, and the writer is Sabrina Strings. One of the facilitators introduced me to the other participants and said something to the effect of, Sabrina, what do you think? Why are Black people sick? It was a question asked in earnest. Some of the experts had devoted their entire careers to addressing questions surrounding racial health inequities. Years of research, and in some instances failed interventions, had left them baffled. Why are Black people so sick? My answer was swift and unequivocal. Slavery. My colleagues looked befuddled as they tried to come to terms with my reply. I meant what I said. The era of slavery was when white Americans determined that Black Americans needed only the bare necessities, not enough to keep them ultimately safe and healthy. It set in motion Black people's diminished access to healthy foods, safe working conditions, medical treatment, and a host of other social inequities that negatively impacted health. Evaluating the inadequate and questionable data about race, weight, and COVID-19 complications with these insights in mind makes it clear that obesity and its affiliated, if incorrect, implication of poor lifestyle choices. Black Americans had higher rates of multiple chronic illnesses and a lower life expectancy than white Americans, regardless of weight. This is an indication that our social structures are failing us. These failings and the accompanying embrace of the belief that Black bodies are uniquely flawed are rooted in a shameful era of American history that took place hundreds of years before this pandemic. I rated this article good. Up next,
from the publication AmericanPsychologicalAssociation.org, entitled, We Are Living in a Racism Pandemic, says APA President. Tagline, High-profile racial incidents taking heavy psychological toll. Writer, Kim Mills. Following is a statement from Sandra L. Schulman, Ph.D., President of the American Psychological Association, regarding the mental health consequences of the recent high-profile violent events targeting African Americans. George Floyd, dead after a police officer knelt on his neck. Ahmaud Arbery, fatally shot while on a jog. Breonna Taylor, shot to death by police raiding her home. Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Trayvon Martin. The list is far too long and ever growing. The deaths of innocent black people targeted specifically because of their race, often by police officers, are both deeply shocking and shockingly routine. If you're black in America, and especially if you are a black male, it's not safe to go birding in Central Park, to meet friends at a Philadelphia Starbucks, to pick up trash in front of your own home in Colorado, or to go shopping almost anywhere. We are living in a racism pandemic, which is taking a heavy psychological toll on our African American citizens. The health consequences are dire. Racism is associated with a host of psychological consequences, including depression, anxiety, and other serious, sometimes debilitating conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder and substance use disorders. Moreover, the stress caused by racism can contribute to the development of cardiovascular and other health diseases. I grade this a fair article, good in that it's connecting finally things that have been connected long ago, which this agency has been slow to respond to adequately, in my humble opinion, and very good because it's bringing to light the connections between police, institutional, and societal violence and indifference toward the Black ADOS community. And next.
How are we here again? Black America on edge at the police killing of George Floyd. From the publication Herald Mail Media. Authors Jenny Jarvie and Melissa Edahad. From the Los Angeles Times. It was if someone had lighted a fuse. Almost as soon as a cell phone video appeared on social media showing a black man struggling to breathe and finally going silent with his neck under the knee of a white Minneapolis police officer, Black Americans in the city's Longfellow neighborhood took to the streets calling for justice. Within days, the city was smoldering as protesters started fires, torched stores, and a police station. Demonstrations swiftly spread to Los Angeles, where activists blocked the highway, and Atlanta, where protesters set a police vehicle on fire and smashed the windows of the CNN Center. Watching it all play out on the news, Christy Peters, a 43-year-old real general contractor in Atlanta, cried for 3 days straight. "It's just a lot to carry," she said. "I think it just comes from a place of feeling ineffectual because what you're asking black people to do is to have faith in a system where almost every position of power in this system is led by people who look like, speak like, vote like the very people who are perpetrating this against us." I grade this article a good.
And that's it for this week's Rapid News. All articles featured will be posted in our Facebook group and in the show notes on our website.
Time now for the main event.
In this week's main event, we will interview the article titled, "I'm a Black Man in a COVID-19 Hotspot. I don't have sympathy for people of color who won't social distance." Author John Blake. From the publication CNN.com. Daud will ask the questions and I will give the answers.
Mr. Blake, first of all, from your article, I can tell that you care for your black neighbors and black people in general, given our disproportionate death numbers as it relates to what we are being told about COVID-19. What are your experiences in your neighborhood which concern you so much to write this opinion piece?
A group of my neighbors had taken their house party to the street. Streams of smiling people without face masks spilled into the cul-de-sac ahead of me, blocking my only route home. Never mind that we live in a viral hotspot, predominantly black DeKalb County, which has the second highest number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Georgia. They partied on as I waited for a path to clear.
So being inconvenienced by partygoers motivated you to write such a scathing opinion of your neighbors. What else concerned you?
I've been thinking about those neighbors as I read stories with civil rights advocates saying black people and brown people are facing harsher treatment by law enforcement officers for violating coronavirus safety orders. But there's a question I never see addressed in any of those stories.
That is?
Why isn't there any moral outrage directed at those same black or brown people who refuse to take precautions that would protect their community?
Well, we of the Articles of ADOS have been aware of the as you say, moral outrage, as it has been expressed by the likes of Fat Joe, Lil Wayne recently, black elected officials, black male professionals, and entertainers on the NAACP's Zoomcast recently weighed in their moral outrage. Even the Surgeon General literally chastised black behavior habits that need to be changed in order to deal with the virus crisis that you somehow missed. So make sure I understand you. So to make sure I understand you, you were inconvenienced getting home after what may have been a hard day at the office. You are delayed getting home because your neighbors were partying in your neighborhood, on your street. So you decide to point out the behaviors of what you see as the problems of all black ADOS youth. In an America that often finds illegitimate excuses for black deaths, injuries, and incarcerations due to poor black ADOS supposed pathological behaviors. Am I understanding what you are indicating correctly?
There are legitimate concerns about how law enforcement has treated people of color during this pandemic. I've seen troubling stories from black men saying they were forced to leave a store in Illinois because they wore surgical masks, and accusations that New York police were targeting people of color while enforcing social distancing rules and used excessive force after the incidents escalated.
Mr. Blake, I'm having a problem with what you just said. In one of your examples, where you clearly identify police misconduct, did you realize that in one of your other examples, where a black man is protecting himself and others by wearing a mask, this man was being penalized for complying with health directives? In being critical of some people in your neighborhood being out of compliance, are you not also concerned about how black ADOS, not people of color who are not experiencing our levels of death and legal scrutiny, are being targeted by law enforcement and white vigilantes, whether being in compliance or out of compliance?
But I'm not talking about those incidents. I'm talking about videos showing groups of black people holding ruckus birthday parties or house parties, or the black man who filmed a crowd standing on cars and dancing to music in Cincinnati while declaring, "We don't give a about this coronavirus." Do they really deserve the same amount of sympathy as men of color who fear wearing masks in public?
So you are abdicating that if black ADOS are out of compliance, specifically our youth, they need and deserve to be racially profiled, brutalized, and arrested? Not necessarily in that order, according to you.
We defend black people who are harassed by police for everything from hashtag sitting in Starbucks while black to hashtag barbecuing while black. Now it seems like we're on the verge of inadvertently adding a new category for racial profiling, spreading COVID-19 while black. I say this not because I want to lecture people about respectability politics, how black people should just act right and white folks will leave them alone. I say this because I'm a black man who lives in a black community, and black Americans have been disproportionately hammered by the virus. I wonder if I will make it through the next 2 years. I wonder if I'll lose any family or friends. And I wonder if I'll ever again hug my mother, who lives in an assisted living facility in a black neighborhood.
Also, according to your heartfelt concerns about your mother, friends, yourself, and neighbors, of whom you were not close enough with in order to share your concerns and possibly motivated at least some of them to change their behaviors. Your concerns regarding compliance does absolutely nothing for black people who are complying with social distancing. Are you aware of recent data?
No comment.
Though black ADOS are wearing masks to remaining in their homes in quarantine, many of us are still getting sick, accosted by white vigilantes and police, as well as dying. Are you aware of any of this, Mr. Blake? If so, did you consider any of this while you were seated in your car, frustrated that your young black neighbors were enjoying themselves at your expense?
No comment.
So you failed, either through ignorance or blatant disregard for the fact that blacks in compliance with Surgeon General and CDC guidelines to avoid transmitting or contracting COVID-19 related illness are still getting sick.
I have no response.
The reason I'm so confrontational, sir, is that it was reported by MarketWatch 10 days prior to the publishing of this article, by the way, and I quote, "The majority of new COVID-19 hospitalizations in New York are people who stayed at home, who obeyed social distancing expectations, who remain quarantined in their homes." Were you aware of this, sir?
I have no comment.
Did you care to be aware of at least most of the factors involved in COVID-19 related illness infection? Well, one of them, as was learned and experienced in Wuhan, China and Lombardy, Italy, was people living in close proximity to polluting industries. So maintaining social distancing and remaining in quarantine makes Black people who've been redlined and zoned into such areas more susceptible to illness and other forms of disease. Because by adhering to quarantine, such people remain in toxic environments that grow more toxic the longer they remain indoors. So in your motivation to correct bad Black behaviors, you in essence were condemning Black people to more illness and death. This could be another reason Black leaders, as you say, have some hesitancy in cajoling Black ADOS behaviors. Yet despite this, you go on to criticize them as well.
There is another reason why it's hard for Black leaders to call out this behavior. It would violate one of the 10 commandments of Blackness. Thou shalt not criticize your own people in the presence of white folks. We traditionally have those self-critiques for all Black venues like the Black church or barbershop, sacred communal spaces beyond the white gaze. But many of those places of community are shut down by the coronavirus.
Excuse me. So Blacks are largely following social distancing and quarantine guidelines, particularly Black businesses, correct?
Any person of color who risks the lives of their community through reckless behavior doesn't deserve to be treated as a modern-day Rosa Parks.
Well, sir, no one here, not even the civil rights leaders you claim to have discussed this with, equated Black youth, whom you had a bad interaction with civil rights pioneers. You are making that false association to buttress your self-absorbed views. Isn't that correct, sir?
I have no comment.
Isn't that correct, sir?
Maybe it's time for a little self-reflection. We lament how the coronavirus is devastating our communities, and then we protest when police break up large social gatherings or crack down on other reckless behavior. We can't have it both ways. We lack the moral high ground on this, and we have much bigger issues to fight, such as the fight for survival.
Well, here you've expressed another false assumption. We protest double standards in treatment, sir. Are you making the case for the police to continue their disproportionate ticketing, brutalizing, and criminalizing our women, men, and youth because you believe this somehow betters our chances of surviving this crisis? Really?
I have no comment.
How do you manage these contradictions in just this last example?
I have never been so afraid just to step out of my house. I drove around my neighborhood this past week and saw people crammed in restaurants and barbecuing in the park, not practicing social distancing. I saw employees handing fast food to drive-through customers while wearing no gloves and with masks dangling off their necks. And I was jogging around an otherwise empty track recently when a runner suddenly drew up next to me, coughed up phlegm, and then spit, just as he passed me.
Sir, you are just giving me expressions of your personal feelings of inadequacy and lack of social skills with your own neighbors. Yet you still did not explain your desire to see Black ADOS people more criminalized on top of the historical and current precursors that made our people most susceptible to this virus or any other malady, which has absolutely nothing to do with young people violating social distancing rules. How about where this all began? What about elite white Americans who traveled right out of Wuhan, China? Those who were made aware of the outbreak and still traveled to the States.
I have no comment.
How about once in the States, being made fully aware of the dangers that were unleashing in Wuhan, they still did not take protective or preventative measures from spreading the illness? What about that, sir? Why did you not write about this months ago, in mid-January, for instance, as to the white elite travelers and the dangers they pose to all Americans for the flagrant disregard for all Americans' health and well-being?
I have no comment.
In looking at your recent history at CNN, I found something of interest and related to my concerns about this article you wrote.
How so?
Sir, do you recall writing an article published September 22nd of 2019 entitled, "Sure, Black People Can Be Racist Too"?
Yes.
I will not go into the details of yet another false argument you promoted in that article. A stance usually expressed by whites perpetuating white domination racist talking points. However, I would like to ask, Why, in the instance of the COVID-19 virus hammering, were you consciously choose to say people of color through its disproportionate negative health-related impacts we experience? Yet when talking about a racialized group perpetuating racist behaviors in the very title, you had no problem saying flat out the phrase black people. Why is that?
I have no comment.
There are some people in various professions, especially in journalism, who created a space where they act as Negro whisperers. Ever hear the phrase? Well, some do so by putting a spotlight on what the white collective has labeled black pathology, yet are the very negative things white elites engage in. But somehow to these black gatekeepers, elite whites somehow get a pass. Excuse me, let me approach this last question this way. Given your contradictions, false equivalencies, and benign neglect of most of the institutional racist violence circumstances which have played more of a significant role in black ADOS disproportionate suffering in the result of COVID-19, is it possible you have something more problematic going on about or within yourself? Is there a better way you would like to express this instead of blaming all black youth for what black youth did in your neighborhood? Something that would better explain what is going on here in this article you wrote. Something you'd like to share with our listeners.
I have a confession. I would have had no problem with police coming out to my neighbor's house that night and issuing citations to everyone who violated social distancing orders at that party. You can confiscate my black card for saying so. The people who endangered my family and their own community are no victims of racial persecution to me. And they shouldn't be to you either.
Even if they still get sick, overly battered, overly jailed, overly fined, and disproportionately murdered in police interactions? I see. Well, that completes this interview. Coming up, we have the commentary on this article. Did we like it? Did we hate it? Stay tuned.
We want to take the time to give our friends and listeners a shout out. Thank you for clicking that subscribe button and for liking and sharing the podcast. You can also continue supporting the show by joining our Patreon, where you can receive exclusive content and promotional items for as little as $3 a month. Sponsoring the show will ensure that we can continue to bring you the news and information important to your ADOS life. So head on over and join us at patreon.com/articles of ADOS. All right, so how do we feel about this article?
Hated it. I'm sorry.
First off, when I saw the article, I knew it was a situation where he was going to blame the ADOS community, because that's what a lot of these characters, writers, media outlets, gatekeepers, whoever you want to call them, that's what they do now. Black people could be doing the exact same thing as their neighbor to the right, and he is not going to call out his neighbors to the right, but he will call out the black behavior. So I knew we had to push back on this. And you did a phenomenal job in that.
We did a phenomenal job.
And if you pointed out his hypocrisy in, because he had a bad experience in his neighborhood and in his personal life, that he's going to blame the whole black community. Expound on his approach in the sense that he is okay with black people being cited, punished, being arrested for doing the exact same thing as his neighbors to the right would do.
I cannot help but believe that this is a particular individual. When I researched his online work with CNN, when you look at that body of work, a pattern emerges. And this is what I've loved about the ADOS movement, Tone and Yvette's ability to create a space where we can easily identify our friends, allies, or foes. He is definitely a foe. When you look at his body of work, his attempts, I believe, have been to etch out a space where he can be a Negro whisperer. How does he do this? Because he'll take some time in his writings to illustrate black pathology. So all he did was continue an ongoing process of denigrating and marginalizing historically despised groups, particularly ours in America. And he does so subtly, so he doesn't come off automatically as anti-black. But when you look at the particulars from the contradictions, false associations, it reveals itself clearly. He's a person who's positioned himself to be a black gatekeeper by way of journalism.
So he's rewarded for his position, his anti-black position. He obviously gets published through CNN. He obviously his voice will be one that can be used in opposition to a lot of our things that we're trying to get done. So, what do you do with these type of anti-black gatekeepers?
He can also present articles where he can show that he sides with some of our interests. He is like what Yvette has recently been expounding upon, and that is those who bob and weave in and out of traffic. Mm-hmm. And so that can be pointed out. When people are doing that behavior, observable in any field, especially when they get the mic and are thrusted upon the American scene, they can be identified for what they are. They are both grifter types and people that are etching out of space so they can survive the slings and arrows of direct white domination racism. At the same time, they cannot be seen as predictable, dependable advocates for our lower caste status. They just cannot be. They cannot be relied upon. And so they should be pointed out, as we so clearly and evidently did in this exchange regarding his recent article.
Yeah. So I'm sure I'm looking forward to his next article on how black people are constantly burning down their own neighborhoods based off the protests of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. I can't wait for his next article on blaming black people for the murders of themselves. So,
he can also diminish that in his next article and emphasize the justification for people being upset. And he could talk about that generally. At the same time, we should not allow him to forget that he wrote something like this and like you just said, not be surprised if he comes up with something like that. Either way, we should be able to confront this man on his attempts at maintaining his black gatekeeper status.
And one last thing, he did point out that there's this idea that black people can't criticize other black people, or this idea that, don't publicize, talk about it amongst ourselves, but don't publicize or, the criticism that he have. And I don't think that's a fair assessment of, our community. But if it's something that, for instance, this situation where if we notice that we're doing something that every other American is doing and we are disproportionately being harassed and arrested for it, there's a obvious double standard. It's not about us accepting criticism. It's about us noticing that there's something unfair going on. Of course we want to be safe in our communities, but all communities look like that. Not everybody is wearing masks. Not everybody is social distancing. So why are you focused on whether or not what young black people are doing when countless people sitting on the beach next to each other, not social distancing? The disproportionate consequence to not social distancing is not fair. And the criticism of us not social distancing is not fair either.
I would like to see him criticize and castigate the internal discussion that Europeanized Jews have. They have those discussions we don't get to hear about, or not even allowed or expected to be in, and we don't expect to be in those. We should have our space to talk about our issues and dislike outside intervention in that. Comedians have talked about this all the way to Mr. Coates has talked about that when whites wonder why they can't say the N-word. Either way, we have a right to be human, and a part of that is group dynamics where we self-criticize and talk about our stuff that we don't want outsiders to know. That is a part of what makes us human. Our abilities to translate that and exert our will in the society. Now, that's the challenge. That's the other thing, of which, of course, he shows what side he takes. Just, personalities like this. He's probably a nice guy. Really a nice guy to get to know.
He's almost, I'm sorry.
I know.
I was about to say he's almost conservative in this sense.
Well, you see, it's a human thing because, and this is what I love about the ADOS movement and Tone and Yvette. They've created a space where we can talk about these things with more psychological support and indifference, even in that we can acknowledge that there are black people who don't show consistency with our interests and concerns. It was always difficult to talk about that outwardly and even internally. Well, they've allowed us, they've given us this space to do so. We can criticize people that are undermining our abilities to be full citizens, as we can undermine those people who are trying to steal food from our children's plates, because that's what people like him ultimately do.
I agree. And that's it for the main event. Listeners, you can read this full article on our website in this week's show notes. There you have it, family. Another week, another show. Thanks for joining us on the Articles of ADOS podcast. Make sure to visit our website, articlesofados.com, where you can join our mailing list, see the show notes for today's episode, and to leave us a voice message to be featured on the show.
Now that you're family, we'd love it if you'd like our Facebook page and join our private Articles of ADOS group. This is where you can connect with other listeners, give feedback, and share articles you would like us to discuss. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, send us an email to listeners@articlesofados.com.
Be sure to tune in next Thursday for a new episode of Undiscussed News you may have missed. And join us live for great content and conversation Sundays at 8 p.m. on YouTube, Twitch, Periscope, and in our Facebook group, where we recap and discuss this week's episode. Until next time, family, stay safe, stay strong. Peace.